For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello again, and welcome to this podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and today my podcast will cover Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, which is the last verse in chapter 11, and the last verse in John's introduction to the third woe. You're probably thinking this day would never come when we'd actually finish chapter 11, but that day has come. In the last verse, as we will discuss today, John has a vision of the temple of God that is opened in heaven. Some scholars believe this verse should be part of Revelation chapter 12 because they say it begins a new vision of the church. Those who have such a view obviously don't understand what's going on in Revelation chapter 12, or they would never come to such a conclusion. Verse 19 is appropriately placed at the end of chapter 11 because it completes John's introduction to the third woe and the second coming of Jesus Christ that I've been talking about for the last several podcasts. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 183 in my book that you can find on my website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. So let's begin, as we often do, with the language of this last verse that we'll be studying today. John tells us in Revelation chapter 11, verse 19, that the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. Close quote. The image of the temple in heaven is a symbol for the sign of the Son of Man. The same sign is mentioned in Revelation 15:1, which says, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God." Close quote. Obviously, I'll talk more about this sign of the Son of Man when we get to Revelation chapter 15, but in brief, Joseph Smith Matthew chapter 1 verse 36 states that after the tribulation of those days, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Close quote. Hiram Andrus describes the timing of the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the second woe, when we have the final abomination of desolation, and the beginning of the third woe, when we have the final plagues that Brother Andrus refers to as cataclysmic events immediately before Christ's second coming, saying, "The abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel will again be poured out upon Jerusalem. Immediately after this last event, the sun will be darkened and the moon turned to blood. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, as the veil is rent and his glory covers the earth as the light of the morning that comes out of the east and shines to the west. The righteous dead will be resurrected amid the cataclysmic events that will occur immediately prior to Christ's coming in glory." Close quote. The sign of the Son of Man is the last heavenly sign of the second coming given during the third woe, actually right at the beginning of the third woe, which John describes in Revelation 15:5, saying, "And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened." Close quote. Notice how the language in Revelation 15:5 about the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven corresponds exactly with the language in Revelation 11:19, which says that John saw the temple of God was open in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. The nearly identical language demonstrates very clearly that the last verse in Revelation 11 is linked directly to the content of John's vision that begins in Revelation 15. Now, I've told you before that Revelation chapter 15 begins exactly where Revelation 11 ends. These are the verses which show that this is the case. In other words, we have come to the end of John's introduction to the third woe at the end of Revelation chapter 11. Chapter 12 then begins with this major flashback, taking us to the premortal existence and then continuing chronologically up through the end of chapter 14. I call these the flashback chapters. Then we begin Revelation chapter 15 exactly where we ended in Revelation 11:19, with the only thing separating them are these three huge flashback chapters. That is, Revelation 15:1 will resume after the flashback chapters with the sign of the Son of Man, right where John left off with the same sign here in Revelation 11:19. Now, in addition to the sign of the Son of Man in Revelation 11:19, we also have lightnings and voices and thunderings and earthquake and a great hail. These are all part and parcel of the 7 final vial plagues of the third woe that will occur simultaneously with the second coming, as described in Revelation chapter 16. For example, Revelation 16 verses 17 to 18 have language that is nearly identical with what we're seeing here in this last verse of chapter 11, saying, "And the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven, from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great." Close quote. Now, if I hadn't told you where this language comes from and in which verses it appears, you could be thinking that I'm reading Revelation 11:19 or I'm reading chapter 16, verse 18. They're very much identical. So obviously, we're going to be getting into more details about these final plagues, including the lightnings, the voices, the thunders, the earthquake, etc., when I begin podcasting the contents of Revelation chapter 16. So you just have to be patient, because we still have 3 chapters of flashback before we even get to the actual description of John with his detailed account of the third woe. So for now, let's talk a little bit more about this temple that John saw opened in heaven in Revelation 11:19. This heavenly temple is in the likeness of the earthly temple of Herod that existed at Jerusalem and that would have been familiar to John, as explained by Joseph Seiss, saying, "There is a heavenly temple and worship from which the tabernacle and temple of the Jews was copied. When Jehovah directed the building of them, he said to Moses, Look, that thou make them after their pattern which was showed thee in the mount." And the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews calls them copies or likenesses of things in the heavens. Close quote. The temple that exists in heaven is the pattern for the earthly tabernacle and temple. Hugh Nibley says the heavenly temple is the place where God dwells, and that the earthly temple is merely an imitation and a model. Truman Madsen gives this historical perspective of what John sees in Revelation 11:19, saying, The temple in heaven has its roots in the notion of the heavenly pattern according to which Moses was instructed to build the tabernacle, in Exodus 25, for example. This passage does not necessarily suggest that there was a temple up there in heaven which Moses was shown, but it does not take long in the history of Jewish thought for this to develop into the full-blown notion of a temple in heaven, of which the temple on earth is, to some extent, a copy. Close quote. The temple that John saw in heaven open to symbolize the veil or curtain of heaven rolling back like a scroll at the second coming to reveal Jesus Christ. Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 95, fills in the blanks for us here a little bit, saying, "And there shall be silence in heaven for the space of half an hour, and immediately after shall the curtain of heaven be unfolded, as a scroll is unfolded after it is rolled up, and the face of the Lord shall be unveiled." Close quote. Joseph Fielding McConkie adds this further description of this future event, saying, "The day is fast approaching when the curtain of heaven shall be unfolded as a scroll is unfolded after it is rolled up, and the face of the Lord shall be unveiled. This is called the veil of the covering of my temple in my tabernacle, which hideth the earth, and it shall be taken off, and all flesh shall see me, declared the Lord." And he's quoting Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verse 23. Joseph Fielding Smith adds that the millennium will come when the Lord decides that the cup of iniquity is full. He will come to cleanse the earth, and in that day the veil of the covering of the temple, which hideth the earth, shall be taken off, and all flesh shall see me together, saith the Lord. Close quote. These verses collectively tell us that the veil between heaven and earth that withholds the manifestation of Christ's glory in this telestial world will be removed at the time of his second coming. This is similar to the imagery we saw at the time of Christ's crucifixion, when the atonement was complete and there was a great earthquake in Jerusalem. At that time, the veil of the temple was rent from top to bottom, symbolizing that the atonement of Christ had made the Holy of Holies in the temple accessible to all people. In other words, through the atonement, all people can come into the presence of the Father. Joseph Seiss makes this same symbolic connection, saying, "When Christ paid the ransom price for human sin and introduced an availing righteousness for the race, and a new dispensation of mercy and grace received its foundation stone, the veil of the temple rent, the way into the holiest opened, and the divine began to be visible and approachable again. And this opening of the temple in heaven at the last trumpet expresses the same idea. Hence, as this trumpet begins to sound, the mists begin to lift from sacred things. The excluding barriers give way. The seclusion yields to human gaze and approach. The veil withdraws. The holy begins to disclose itself again, and the temple of heaven opens." Close quote. When the veil of the temple in heaven symbolically opens in Revelation 11:19, the world shall see Christ as he descends in the clouds from his heavenly throne as King of Kings. This vision of Christ coming in the clouds of heaven has a dual meaning. On the one hand, he will descend from heaven and clouds will literally be present. In addition to this, the holy angels will attend dressed in white, having the appearance of white clouds. Finally, Joseph Fielding McConkie tells us that the clouds in heaven are a symbol of God's glory, saying, "The glory of God is equated with the clouds of heaven. It was revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith that after the temple in the New Jerusalem is built, a cloud shall rest upon it. which cloud shall be even the glory of the Lord," quoting Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, verse 5. Many passages of Scripture reveal that at the time of the second coming, Jesus Christ will come in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Close quote. Before we talk about what John sees when the veil of the temple in heaven is symbolically open, let me first describe just briefly what the veil was like in the earthly temple between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Actually, let me have Joseph Fielding McConkie describe it for you. He said, "A thick curtain separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle. The veil was made of fine linen, as were the gate to the court and door to the tabernacle, and like them, it was beautifully embroidered in blue, purple, and scarlet. It differed from the other entrances because it bore figures of cherubim, or the angels of God. During the migrations of Israel, the veil was used to cover the Ark of the Covenant." Close quote. This thick curtain, called the veil, separated the holy place in the temple from the Holy of Holies. The perfectly square enclosure called the Holy of Holies is the place where the Ark of the Covenant was located. The lid for the Ark of the Covenant had two cherubim facing each other with their wings outstretched. Between them is the place called the mercy seat, which represented the earthly throne of Jehovah. With this historical information in mind, let's now turn to Revelation 11:19 again, which states that when the temple in heaven was opened, that is to say, the veil of the temple was rolled back, John could see the Ark of his Testament, or the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy of Holies. What John refers to here as the Ark of his Testament is more commonly referred to as the Ark of the Covenant. Both names refer to the same object, namely the chest that Indiana Jones tried to recover in the movie called The Raiders of the Lost Ark. Easton's Bible Dictionary describes the chest in the following manner. The sacred ark is designated by a different Hebrew word, Aaron, which is the common name for a chest or coffer used for any purpose. It is distinguished from all others by such titles as the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant, Ark of the Testimony. The ark was deposited in the Holy of Holies and was so placed that one end of the poles by which it was carried touched the veil which separated the two apartments of the tabernacle. The two tablets of stone which constituted the testimony or evidence of God's covenant with the people, the pot of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded were laid up in the ark. Close quote. The Ark of the Covenant symbolizes Jesus Christ. In other words, John saw the Ark of the Testament when the temple in heaven was opened as a symbol of Jesus Christ. Here, John introduces us symbolically to Christ's second coming. So why doesn't John just simply say that when the heavenly temple opened, he saw Jesus Christ? First of all, that would be too easy. Second, a direct statement would be inconsistent with the genre of the entire book of Revelation that is filled with signs and symbols that add much more meaning to our understanding of the events described than if John simply told us what they were. Third, the imagery is telling us more about the meaning of Christ's second coming than the mere fact of its occurrence. The Ark of the Testimony symbolizes Christ's enduring covenant to bless and protect his righteous people. That's why we call it the Ark of the Covenant. The covenant is symbolized by the items placed inside the ark, including the stone tablets that contain the commandments written by the finger of the Lord. These tablets represented the covenant relationship that was entered into between Jehovah and the tribes of Israel at Mount Sinai, as described by Joseph Fielding McConkie, saying, The tablets upon which the commandments were written were then housed in the Ark of the Covenant, so named because the commandments constituted their covenant. Similarly, when the Ark of the Covenant was housed in the tabernacle in the wilderness, it became known as the Ark of the Testimony, this name having reference to Israel's covenant to abide the law given on Sinai. Close quote. In addition to the stone tablets, we also had the pot of manna, representing Jesus Christ as the bread of life. But we see in this incorruptible pot of manna a symbol of Christ's covenant to bless and nurture his people. We also have the rod of Aaron that Moses used when performing some of the plagues in Egypt. During the wilderness wanderings described in Numbers chapter 17, there was a sedition against Moses and Aaron's rod budded as a sign of divine approval of their leadership, and this quelled the rebellion. This same rod, with the budded parts on it, was placed in the Ark of the Covenant. This imagery carries with it the symbol of a promise of eternal life to the faithful followers of Jehovah and his ordained servants. Why is the budding rod a symbol of eternal life? Because it's a stick. It was just a stick, a dead stick incapable of generating buds and growing like a tree with roots that could absorb the nutrients from the ground. New growth and new life are promised to the faithful where growth and endless life seems impossible. This is the covenant God has made with his righteous and obedient children, and the tokens of this covenant are manifested in the items that were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. John saw the Ark, or Christ, in the midst of the vial plagues of the third woe to symbolize that Christ will fulfill his protective covenant with righteous Israel at the second coming. Joseph Seiss explains the imagery, saying, "Not a promise is obsolete or dead. And now, at the ending of time, that golden box reappears. As the Jews believed the old ark would be brought out again in the days of Israel's blessing, so the ark of God's covenant is now seen in the temple on high. And its appearance here is a token of the recurrence of all these wonders, only on a completer, grander, and sublimer scale. It tells of the speedy fulfillment of all that God hath spoken, and the putting into living force all that he has engaged to do." Close quote. The symbolism of the protective powers of the ark comes from the time of Joshua, when the ancient Israelites entered the promised land with the Ark of the Covenant ahead of their company to give them power over their enemies. When the Israelites entered the land of Canaan after 40 years of wandering, the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant were the first to pass over the Jordan River that dried up so that they were able to pass through on dry ground, as they had done 40 years earlier when the Israelite company passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. Gerald Lund explains the typology of these events, saying, "The Ark of the Covenant, which symbolized the presence of Jehovah, went before the camp of Israel and led the way into the new land. Like passing through the Red Sea, Israel again passed through the midst of the waters to enter the promised land. The Lord specifically connected the two events by asking that a memorial be built. The crossing of Israel into the new land was also done on the first day of Passover, again invoking the typology of deliverance from bondage and death." Close quote. Once the Israelites passed through the Jordan River on dry ground with the Ark of the Covenant at their head, the ark went ahead of the procession that encircled Jericho 7 times and caused the walls to collapse. The ark was then carried at the head of the armies of Israel as they battled and defeated the Canaanites in the promised land. The use of the ark by the Israelites anciently is a type and foreshadow for what John now sees symbolically in Revelation 11:19. In this verse, John saw the ark symbolically going forth ahead of Christ's saints in the clouds of heaven at the second coming. Keeping in mind that the ark represents Christ, so it is Christ going ahead of his saints, which is described more directly and expressly without all the symbolism in Doctrine and Covenants, section 45, verse 44, saying, "And then they shall look for me, and behold, I will come, and they shall see me in the clouds of heaven, clothed with power and great glory, with all the holy angels, and he that watches not for me shall be cut off." Close quote. What John describes symbolically, Wilford Woodruff also describes directly, saying, "Warfare will continue until the scene is wound up, and Christ descends in the clouds of heaven, and the holy angels with him, and the dead in Christ shall rise first to meet him at his coming. The Lord Almighty will sustain the kingdom and back up his servants and their testimony, and he will send judgments and plagues and afflictions and destroying angels and visit the wicked nations with an overwhelming destruction." Close quote. Christ will protect the angels that are with him and his righteous saints who may yet be upon the earth from the vial plagues as he restores Israel to her promised lands at the second coming, which Bruce R. McConkie has spoken of in this somewhat lengthy but informative quote, saying, "In a setting relative to the millennium and the gathering of Israel, Isaiah says, 'There shall be an highway for the remnant of his people which shall be left,' that is, those who are left because they have abided the day of our Lord's coming shall find a highway to lead them to their appointed gathering places. It shall then be," Isaiah says, "like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. As the Lord provided a highway through the Red Sea for his people anciently, as they traveled to their promised land, so will he provide a way for them to travel in the latter days." Our latter-day revelation, after stating that the great deep shall be driven back into the north countries and that the continents shall become one land, states that they who are in the north countries, meaning the 10 tribes, shall return, and an highway shall be cast up in the midst of the great deep for them. Would we go too far astray if we were to suggest that the highway is created by the joined land masses, and that as ancient Israel found a dry path through the Red Sea, so latter-day Israel will find a dry path where the Atlantic Ocean once was? Close quote. Since the ancient Ark of the Covenant also represented the throne of Jehovah, the Ark in the heavenly temple also symbolizes God's throne in his celestial kingdom. This is a view shared by multiple scholars, including J. Perry, who wrote that John speaks of the temple which is in heaven, or the temple of heaven, which is John's name for the celestial kingdom. Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie explains what John saw in Revelation 11:19, saying, "Here, John sees the ark in the temple in heaven, signifying, as Paul had taught aforetime, that all the faithful saints may now enter the Lord's eternal Holy of Holies and there receive celestial rest." Close quote. From his heavenly throne, the Father directs 7 final angels to pour out the 7 vial plagues of the third woe that will include these lightnings, voices, thunderings, and earthquake and great hail, as recorded in 16:1 that I talked about a little bit ago, but we'll quote here again, saying, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, 'Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth.'" Close quote. So we're going to have plenty of time in the future to talk about these 7 vial plagues, so I'm not going to spend much time on them today other than to share with you just one quote from Joseph Seiss, who said, "The symptoms which attend the sounding of the last trump are the most remarkable, the most numerous, and the most intense, both in heaven and on earth, that are anywhere detailed in the Scriptures. There were many mighty wonders attendant upon the deliverance of the chosen people from Egypt and their planting in the promised land. And so, when Jerusalem was finally destroyed, there were signs and sounds and voices and portents which have sent their report down through the ages, and which still oppress the breathing of people to hear about. But neither of these, nor all of them together, can at all approach the overwhelming intensity of the manifestations which attend the sounding of the last trump." Close quote. Keep in mind that in Revelation 19, John is simply introducing the third woe, including these thunderings, lightnings, voices, etc., that will be part of the 7 vial plagues, which he will fully describe in Revelation chapter 16. It's rather self-obvious, but Matthew Poole's commentary from 1685 confirms my own view of this saying. Lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail, by terrible things in righteousness, as the psalmist speaketh, the consequence of which were the 7 vials, of which we read, Revelation 16, 1-21, pouring out plagues upon the anti-Christian party until they should be wholly rooted out and Christ alone should be exalted in his church and rule as king upon his holy hill of Zion. Close quote. John Wesley wrote in 1765 about these lightnings, voices, and thunders, and an earthquake and great hail, saying, "The very same there are, and in the same order, when the 7th angel has poured out his vial." Revelation 16, 17-21. One place answers the other. What the trumpet there denounces in heaven is there executed by the vial upon earth. First, it is shown what will be done, and afterwards it is done. Close quote. So what I'm essentially saying is that from at least the 1700s, we have known that John merely introduces the 7 final plagues in connection with the second coming of Jesus Christ, and then he gives a complete description of them in Revelation chapter 16. Now, what I am telling you is not novel, nor is it new, even though there are those who confuse these symbols unnecessarily. So let's now correlate the imagery of the ancient ark and the vial plagues that John sees in Revelation 11:19. We learn that anciently the Ark of the Covenant that went ahead of the armies of Israel was a source of death and plagues on Israel's enemies. Remember, that's why the Germans were trying to get the Ark in the movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. They thought the Ark possessed some powerful weapon that could be used once it was harnessed against the Allies in World War II. As you know from the end of the movie, the Ark did in fact possess great destructive powers, but it turned out that the Germans were the ones that ended up dead at the end of the movie. The Germans should have paid more attention to their studies of the Philistines in the Old Testament before trying to get their hands on the Ark of the Covenant. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 3, we learn that the Ark of the Covenant stood at the sanctuary in Shiloh, but it fell into the hands of the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4, verses 10-11. The Philistines then learned by sad experience that their possession of the ark only brought misfortunes, death, and cursings, so they sent it back to Israel in 1 Samuel chapter 6. The Israelites who were given charge of the ark understood better than anyone about the dangers associated with the Ark of the Covenant. They knew this because when King David was transporting the ark to the city of David at Jerusalem, the ox cart that carried the ark shook suddenly, and the ark was about to tip over or fall off of the wagon that was carrying it. A Levite named Uzzah attempted to steady the ark by reaching out to hold the ark in its place. Of course, touching the ark was strictly forbidden. As a result of his touching the ark, Uzzah was stricken and died on the spot, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now, this seems a little harsh to me, since Uzzah obviously had good intentions, and I wonder if this is the origin of the phrase, "no good deed goes unpunished." The point of all this is to teach a sacred principle. That is, if you keep the covenants of God, then the ark, or Jesus Christ, will be a source of protection and blessing. But if you don't keep the covenants and you disobey God's law, then the ark, or Christ, becomes a source of destruction and cursing. This imagery would have been immediately obvious to John's Jewish audience, as explained by Craig Keener, saying, Jewish hearers of the book would also be aware that the covenant had been deposited in the ark, and that the covenant was associated with the stipulations and curses or plagues against the disobedient. Close quote. Joseph Seiss adds his helpful insights into the dual symbolism of the ark that is both deadly and protective, saying, "And as the ark of his covenant is revealed to give joy and hope to the parties to that covenant, lower nature is set in dread commotion to harbinger the bursting forth of his indignation upon his adversaries." Close quote. The deadly vial plagues that destroy the wicked in Revelation 11:19 and in Revelation 16 with much more detail are the antitype for the destruction of Israel's ancient enemies. This destruction of the wicked has long been predicted, including the predictions of Paul, the apostle, in 2 Thessalonians 2:8, saying, "And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming." Close quote. So John saw and heard in Revelation 11:19 the portents of a storm of judgments about to fall on the rebellious people of earth that he describes as lightnings, thunders, earthquake, and a great hail. These are emblems of God's presence and of his judgments. Marvin Vincent refers to them as the solemn salvos of the artillery of heaven. These solemn salvos of heavenly artillery will literally destroy the wicked and their earthly kingdoms, thereby cleansing the earth for the coming millennium, as explained by Hensard Knowles, saying, "And there were lightnings, and voices, and thunderings, and an earthquake, and great hail. By these metaphorical expressions are signified the ruins and destructions of all those nations, kingdoms, potentates, powers, kings, principles, princes, and people that oppose the church of God and the kingdom of Christ on earth in that day. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For the nation and kingdom that will not serve thee shall perish, yea, those nations shall be utterly wasted. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomforted them, especially the righteous judgments and plagues of God upon mystical Babylon in that day of her desolation." Close quote. The devastation and destruction of the 7 vial plagues, symbolized in brief by lightnings, thunders, etc., probably leaves most of us a little bit unsettled. Richard Draper addresses this concern, saying, Some may be concerned because the day of the Lord is filled with such horror, but it has its purpose. Nothing unclean can enter into the Lord's presence and survive. The glory of God is about to sweep the earth so that the holy cities can be established with their paradisiacal gardens and temples. Therefore, evil must come to an end. Close quote. When the plagues of the second coming come to an end and the paradisiacal conditions of the earth are restored, the earth will then become Christ's footstool where the wicked cannot stand. Donald W. Perry explains the footstool imagery, saying, "The earth as a footstool suggests a position of complete submission. The Lord rules from his throne, but he puts the earth under his feet. People on earth, even those of great power and wealth, are as nothing compared to the Lord. When the Lord spoke in our day of the earth as his footstool, he did so saying that he would yet stand on it again." Close quote. Fortunately, as I have mentioned in prior podcasts, Christ will mercifully spare those that live at least a terrestrial law at his second coming. His mercy is symbolically expressed by the mercy seat that sits atop the Ark of the Covenant from John's vision that I've been talking about today in this podcast. Warren Wiersbe explains the symbolism, saying, "God's people need not fear the storms, for he is in control. The ark reminds them of his presence and the faithfulness of his promises, and on that ark was the mercy seat on which the blood was sprinkled each day of atonement. Even in wrath, God remembers his mercy." Close quote. So let us hope that we are all counted worthy to be numbered among those to whom mercy is extended during the third woe through our covenant keeping and our obedience to the law of God. We know the 7 final plagues of the third woe are coming, and they should be for us a constant reminder of the need to be vigilant in our righteous endeavors. Then and only then can we set our minds at ease about what the future holds in store for us. So that concludes my podcast for today, and it concludes my discussion of Revelation chapter 11. In my next podcast, we will go way back in time to the premortal existence as the flashback chapters begin in Revelation chapter 12. Now, I have to warn you in advance that chapter 12 is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Revelation, so I have a lot to talk about. It's also a chapter that is much misunderstood by scholars, both inside and outside the church. It is also the chapter that Joseph Smith changed most extensively when he did his inspired revision to the Bible. So we have a lot to talk about when we next meet again. Until then, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jen and Kristen for all their technological help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.